And from my far left, you have Professor George Wajakoya, who is a lawyer. Many thanks for joining us in studio, Professor. We also have Oliver Kipchumba, who is also a lawyer. Oliver, good to see you this morning. And last but not least, Mr. Herman Monyora, who is a lecturer and a political analyst. Pleasure to have you on this show this morning, gentlemen. And a lot has been making headlines in the country during over this past week. Top of the agenda is the EALA nomination, something we'll be discussing this morning. But we also have this morning President Uhuru Kenyatta meeting the leadership of the National Assembly with regard to reconstituting his cabinet, meaning that Kenyans have 2 billion shillings in gratuity. Let me begin with you, Professor Wajakoya. During his final State of the Nation address in his first term, President Uhuru Kenyatta was very categorical on reducing the public wage bill, slashing wages of state officers in the country as well. What do you make of the gratuity that some of the legislators are taking home?
I think the president is not serious because we have had these statements before. We have also had situations where he has spearheaded the cabinet by wanting his salaries to be reduced. And there was no law to peg that. Wayside statements do not make any sense. If the president wanted his salary reduced at that particular time, then he ought to have gone through Parliament for Parliament actually to put figures correct. Now, when it comes to this kind of mayhem, as we can see, if somebody has worked as a cabinet secretary and has earned his remuneration, let the remuneration package be in the regulations, be within be within the consent of the people through the electoral representations in Parliament. How did they arrive at those figures and how did they peg? Maybe my learned friend here will help me. I might be ignorant when it comes to issues of salaries because I don't earn any salary from anybody. But why would somebody come up with such a ridiculous amount when the country's GDP and deficit, the country is in deficit, the GDP is very as it is, and also the borrowing pattern is very high. And when it comes to taxation, the taxpayers are going to feel the burden. When we know very well that when these people are in Parliament, or were in the cabinet, they had a lot of packages, they had insurance, they had, and not only insurance for themselves, but roadside insurances for their families and mistresses. I find this very ridiculous.
Let's speak to you, Oliver, on this, because, I mean, as we speak and as we usher in the new year, members of Parliament who've served for 2 consecutive terms are entitled to a send-off package of about 2.8 billion shillings. It is a huge amount of money. This when slimming profits are being witnessed by almost every institution in the country. There is a lot of companies laying off their employees as well. And, you know, there are those who would argue, our members of Parliament, our legislators have worked for this. Let them get their send-off package. But isn't this a bit too much for the taxpayer?
I think looking at it at these economic times, it might look like this is a lot of money. But we need to realize that we have a constitutional commission tasked with the issues of looking into salaries and all this. If it is within the law, and if the gratuity is within the recommendation by the Salary and Remuneration Commission, I think we have no problem. But what we need to look at is the philosophy behind this gratuity. As the good professor said, these people have been given insurances and all manner of privileges. Will it be in order also to give them gratuity when they have earned a lot of privileges along the way, and they have been earning a salary which is among the best we have in the world? Therefore, I think what we need to look at now at this juncture is the philosophy behind this. That how did we reach here whereby people are taking so much money home when we know we have given them loans which are nearly at 1% and all other things. Therefore, what we need to be asking ourselves going forward is that, is it necessary to give these people these amounts of money when the country itself is rising up from economical shambles? So I think going forward, we need to have a discussion as a country of how we want to tame the wage bill and taming it in a manner that it does not target only politicians, but all the civil servants we have among the ranks.
Right.
Because it cannot be that the basket, 10% of the people employed take home 90% of the whatever is in the basket. We need to look at it from the perspective of a development perspective and a third world country whereby we should not be trying so much to lift those ones who can lift themselves. What does this leave other programs like NHIF and what have you? Because here we have somebody who has been having an insurance to the maximum of to a limit of 5 million. And we have other Kenyans who cannot do the same. Yes, we appreciate their position they have played in bringing this country to wherever it is, but it should not be overemphasized.
All right. Mr. Manyora, do we have our priorities right? Because President Uhuru Kenyatta made it very clear that curtailing or reducing the wage bill would be top of his agenda. He used that in his State of the Nation address to lobby for his re-election as well. But do we have our priorities right in this sector?
You know, when we set to the process of constitution making that ended with the Constitution of 2010, there are a number of things that were clear to Kenyans. They stood out very clearly. I'm afraid most of those things have not been actualized or they have aborted. For example, the issue of the imperial presidents. It was top on the agenda, but we are back there. In terms of MPs and other politicians and how greedy they are, Kenyans were very clear about it. And that's why we said that Constitutional Commission, SRC, it's been such a big letdown because they have let the parliamentarians loose and you know how greedy they are. The only time they throw their weight is when they are dealing with nurses and other small fellows in this country, and including people like us. So yes, we have a problem, and as a third world country, we display our poverty in thought and in every other thing, first by being extremely wasteful. Extremely wasteful, which is one way of defining a poor person or a poor country, by how wasteful they are. So the president himself, when he was finance minister some times back, he said that this country wastes about 30% of its revenue, just wasting on corruption and wastage. So now, on top of that, when you add on this greed from our politicians and top civil servants, even when you talk about top civil servants, you know how much they earn. You know how much they earn. If today somebody made you a CS or a PS, I don't know how rich you are, but I would assume you may not be very rich. Today in the social media, there are these things flying left, right about certain ministers or cabinet secretaries that are being asked, how did you acquire a 600 house in Runda? I think you've seen those things. How did you acquire half an acre in Runda? Just the other day, you were a teacher at the University of Nairobi. So really, as a country, going forward, we must... I keep saying, do we really have feelings for the people really who are poor in this country? People who can't even afford a meal. In a country with an unemployment of about 40% and over, in a country where more than half of the population live on less than $1 a day, you cannot afford to have this kind of greed. And you display it. You know, some greed you can have, but quietly. But this one of the MPs, I differed one day with my very good friend on a television show when I told him he was a member of parliament. Unfortunately, didn't make it this time. I told him, my friend, why can't you be mindful of your fellow Kenyans as you go away with all this money? And your villagers, the people you purport to lead, are living in such a misery and squalor. In a city of, this city of Nairobi, over 80% of the people live in very deplorable conditions. How can you afford to go these obscene monies to home? How can you take these obscene monies home? Surely. There's no job that can give you a pension or a send-off package like the one we give these fellows who come from parliament.
2.8 billion shillings.
It's obscene.
For those who served 2 consecutive terms. Professor Wajakoya.
I think also from what my friend Manyora and my colleague and former Kenya School of Law classmate, if I may put it that way, I find this to be very absurd, given the fact that I've lived outside the country for many years and I've seen how things work there. In the UK, for example, this issue of pension does not arise. The contributions you make by your salary is what you gain when you retire. We have social security and income support. You find a former prime minister queuing the line, going for income support, to be pegged with what he contributed while he was prime minister or a cabinet secretary. If you're earning £20,000 and you're contributing probably £1,000 a month towards the social security and welfare benefits, then when you retire, your contributions, social security and housing allowance plus med cover, will probably bring you enough as calculated by the means test, which actually reduces the burden of people going into this efficacy of businessmen, business, let me put it that way, when you retire. That means that now everybody wants to be a cabinet secretary or a PS, and that's why I've refused to apply for those jobs, because I don't think whether I want to fall in those brackets of going to loot from the country. The ideology behind somebody is what makes a man or a woman. I see competing interests right now, and I'm sorry, I'm maybe going to the part 2 of your questioning. Competing interests from people applying. Like now we have 20,000, almost 3,000 people applied for permanent secretary. How do they call them? Maybe
Principal secretary.
yeah, maybe the aim is to go and then steal enough and then retire with a package.
All right, so let's focus on that, because in terms of reducing the public wage bill, it is top of the agenda in stabilizing the economy in the country. Other than the rather hefty gratuity that they're taking home, the rather high salaries or some of the best in the world, there's also cases of corruption in the country. And Mr. Manyora here mentions about 30% of the national GDP is lost, of the national revenue is lost through corruption. How do we tame that, Oliver? Does this call for another legislation? Because we have too many laws in this country. Another legislation to ensure that our members of Parliament are held accountable, or do we now head to the direction where members of Parliament or state officers should not be allowed to conduct any business with the government?
I think the first point is that we do not lack legislation in this country. That is the first point of departure when we are talking about corruption. How and when we need to fight corruption is the problem, and who to fight it. Because we have seen a problem whereby everybody talks about corruption, but nobody fights corruption. So it is just all talk, but no action. And as the president begins his second term, I think this is among the priority areas. For me, I will take that we need to fight corruption in installments. We begin by having the right attitudes toward the fight to corruption. We cannot talk about fighting corruption at higher levels, while at the lowest level, we are the first people to perpetuate corruption. And it goes all the way to the echelons of power in this country. Therefore, the fact that corruption takes 30% of what we have as a nation tells to how much we lag behind and where we were supposed to be if we are to use the resources, the small and the little resources we have in this country, to invest in the right things. Therefore, the issue of salaries and what have you, even the money we are giving these people, it is the same money that makes the thing crowded and very competitive, and people use a lot of means to achieve these positions for the simple reason that I want to achieve this so that I can take that. I want to achieve this so that I can do business. Doing business with government, I think, is a wrong spirit, because there is conflict of interest. I cannot do business with a government I am sitting in there. At the end of the day, there will be leakages and pilferage of public funds. Therefore, I think the president needs to renew his fight on corruption and graft. And he has a chance now, as he chooses his PSS and the CSS, to put people, men and women of integrity, men and women who have stood test of time. This is a chance to break away from the past. There is nobody who is bigger who can hold this country hostage. And the latest happenings have shown that not even politics can hold Kenya hostage. So I believe that even corruption should not hold us hostage. And we as a people must break away from that. And the president should lead from the front.
And of course, the president's vision in the next 5 years is to leave a lasting legacy. Mr. Manyora, other than being the highest paid politicians in the world, Kenyans are also among the highest taxed individuals in the world. Are Kenyans getting value for money in the wake of all these corruption allegations that we've seen? And if not, how do we ensure that accountability is put in place and Kenyans get value for their taxes?
Of course, we are highly taxed. That goes without saying. I think we must be one of the highest taxed people in the world, some of the most highest taxed people in the world. If you consider really what we mean by taxation, beyond what you pay from your salary and your income and business, there's VAT all over the place and so on and so forth. We are highly taxed, it's true. It wouldn't really be a problem if we were taxed and the money was used to deliver services to the people. That is not quite the case in this country. A lot of what government does is done in a substandard way. You purport to give free education. That free education is really not worth the name. Then you talk about health facilities in this country. You see, not every country gives free public health, whatever. Not all countries. There are countries where you have to pay for it, and that's why insurance is very, very important. On our part, we are a semi-welfare state, and we want to give that to the people. It's not quite what you expect it to be. So marrying what we pay in taxes and what we get from government, there is a gap that ought to be addressed by government going forward, really. There are many things we would expect government to do for us, given what we pay as country, as a citizen.
So we'll be waiting to see, how we haven't heard from the Salaries and Remuneration Commission as well speak out on this. But let's move on to the East African Legislative Assembly, which has seen quite a showdown in the country. It was supposed to kick off business on June 4th this year. That was not able to happen because Kenya and South Sudan had not given their list of nominees. Now, this week on Thursday, both NASA and Jubilee have forwarded their list of names, Jubilee forwarding 15, NASA forwarding 12 to the National Assembly, Kenya only having a maximum of 9 slots within the East African Legislative Assembly. But no sooner were those names read out within Parliament that we had cries of nepotism on one hand, those tribalism on the other hand, a case of who knows who appearing on this list. Professor Wajakoya, I don't know if you've seen the lists that have been given, but what does this list, or both lists, say about Kenya's democracy?
Kenya should withdraw from East Africa. Because what I'm seeing is just nepotism, stupidity of the highest order in the world, and foolishness. Why would, for example, NASA come in and say, we are not going to have parliamentary we are not going to contribute our members to the committees to vet or to discuss whatever the cabinet is going to be. And at the same time, they send in names of the obvious. What is Oburu Odinga's relevancy in the political history of today? Why would we have this old man, I'm old as well, I'm 58 years old, being fronted everywhere, nominated when he fails, and now nominated to East African community? Don't we have another Luo who can replace him, or another Kenyan in that case? I feel that to be very absurd. Why should we have Kalonzo's son, Musyoka's son? What experience does he have to be a member of parliament? What representation is going to do? On the other hand, when you go to Jubilee, I'm told, and correct me before I mention, is Duale's brother going there?
No, we do not have that information.
Oh, I see. Then I would rest my case. I would have made a comment on that. Look at the people in Jubilee. It's a rotation from the Kalenjin and the Kikuyu, plus a few Mohammeds here and there. Doesn't Jubilee also have an eye to look at other tribes and say, even if we are mandated by legislation to nominate, why can't we go outside the box to show what we're trying to do? And maybe get a Turkana or a Luya, who is not even a member of Jubilee, to demonstrate some kind of maturity. They have gone for their sycophants. They have fronted their sycophants, and you expect those sycophants to go and represent Kenyans in East Africa? Hell no. I am opposed to that, and it's high time Kenya even packed its bags from East African community, because it's useless. Why would you have the so-called people who are fighting for the nation, the NASA, and so-called Jubilee who have come into power, nominating sycophants who have no brains?
All right. Well, let me hear from you, Oliver, because, at the end of the day, political favors also coming into play here, because when you take a look at both lists by Jubilee and NASA, it is clear most of those in those lists are poll losers who are now looking to be rewarded as party loyalists are coming in there. But again, what does this say about our political parties in terms of reform? Because we're seeing these wrangles within the political parties themselves. Within NASA, for example, we've seen quite a bit of a division with several members of parliament saying there is no ethnic representation, not ethnic, but regional representation, so to speak.
I think the greatest tragedy we are as a nation is using any opportunity we find as a source of employment. That is the main problem. When we look at EALA post as a source of employment, that is where we begin going wrong. When we look at these are positions which are supposed to be given to people who understand what is East Africa, who understand what is integration, who understand what is our dream as a nation as we go to this entity known as EAC. We do not need to reward people. These are not one of those positions we reward political sycophants or political busybodies who hang around power. I think both political parties should lead from the front. And this is not a family business whereby I'm nominating one. It's not a board of a company I formed or some people or a club. It is going to EAC to represent the aspirations of Kenyans. When we talk of integration, we need to see people who have the brains, the capacity, and the intellectual zeal to push forward that agenda. The president talked about a visa-free within the East Africa community. Do some of these people understand how that things work? We do not need to take people there who their main interest will be to go and get salaries. They can be given jobs elsewhere. And then another thing on the part of NASA, I think they should not preach water and engage in taking a lot of whiskey. If they preach water, they should stick in taking water. The democracy they are talking about should be entrenched. When we look at their list, we should not have some names being like we are reading in the Bible, whereby everything and anything must start with Jesus. So this is not, nobody has monopoly of leadership or of ideas in this country. That is the first point. We need people who, when they are seated in that assembly in Arusha, they reflect what we people in this country have. We should not, and then again, the other point is, what is the main point then of saying these are Kenyans if they are from a certain class? We need to get a tailor from Karachuonyo going to EAC and to say, as tailors, this is how we want these things to be done. We need to get a university professor saying, as professionals, this is how we want to, in our eyes, this is how we look at integration. We need to get a policeman saying security issues should be linked this way. But when we reduce the whole thing into employment and what have you, it becomes a joke.
And of course, those positions, are rather crucial, representing the disabled, issues of trade representation. But, Professor, Mr. Manyora, in terms of Kenya's standing within the East African community, initially one on as an economic powerhouse, as, a very stable nation within the East African community, how do you think that position has changed this year?
Well, a lot has changed, and there are small countries that we used to think were way behind us. And in terms of economic growth and growth in other aspects, some of them are beginning to look like they will overtake us. Ethiopia, for example, may not be in the East African community, but within the region, it has kind of overtaken us. Rwanda is doing much better than us in terms of doing business. They are a small economy, of course. Tanzania may as well overtake Kenya as economic powerhouse of this region. Not longer than now, not longer than 10 years. So in terms of our standing, we were way ahead. I used to imagine, if I was somebody senior in this country, I would have run over East Africa in a positive way. I mean, Kenya would have been, in terms of fashion, the Paris or the Italy, if you wish, in terms of banking, those powerful places where people go and hide money. This would have been it. That if you are in East Africa, if you are in Rwanda, if you hadn't visited Nairobi, you had gone nowhere. But we have squandered that opportunity. Here we are now competing with either to small countries and so on. But allow me to say something about the East African Parliament. You see, our national parliaments are themselves useless. Appendages of the executive. You saw recently in Uganda people fighting in parliament. You've seen in Kenya Jubilee dominating, and they go to State House and troop back to parliament and do what the president wants. So if national parliaments are themselves useless, how do you expect the East African Parliament to be any better? In terms of the East African, what this guy calls the East African dream, as a community or whatever we are calling ourselves, if the nations that make up the East African community, there is no vision you can talk about. I'm not seeing a vision for Kenya, for example. How do you expect East Africa to have a vision? Because you are supposed to be merging different visions from different parties that constitute this East African community. So countries themselves are on some kind of autopilot. There is nothing really driving us. So you cannot have the same for the East African community. Therefore, we remain small at the individual nation state level, and the East African thing will not be a dream.
All right. Professor Wajakoya, there has been divisions within the East African community that have also played out this year between Kenya and Tanzania, between Kenya and Uganda. Where would you place Kenya's relationship with its immediate neighbors, also basing from the visitors that we had attend President Uhuru Kenyatta's inauguration?
Before I answer that question, let me expand on what my friend Manyora said. If you look at the mission and vision of the East African, of the European community, which was started on Maastricht Treaty, if you look at the articles of incorporation in the EU or European Community Union, you'll find out that they had an objective before they went and signed it in Maastricht Treaty, and they had aims to look at the rights, fundamental principles of economics, fundamental principles of human rights, tilting towards the willingness as European. And if you find that those people who are sent to Brussels or Luxembourg, in that case, to represent each member state, those were people who had a vision and mission and professionals appointed for the will of what they were going to do there, because they were actually knowledgeable of what East African community was, as opposed to some kind of human beings from the garbage just being picked and sent there, or wives or whims of mistresses going to East African communities to go and clap as sycophants. But now, coming to what you said about the East African integration, you'll find out that because of improper preparation and the roadmap of East Africa, things were done politically without looking into the economic and the philosophy and mindset behind it. So politicians came up, met, ministers came up, met, people came up, met, made some commissions here and there we went. And they were not really prepared. They should have come up with a vibrant economic policy. They would have come up with a vibrant policy to police any inequities in terms of corruption. Kenya is leading in corruption in this part of the world. Why would Uganda want to do business with Kenya? Why would Tanzania want to do business with Kenya? Look at our recent discoveries in oil and gas in the region, and the lapsed railroad that was supposed to actually penetrate into Uganda and bring us revenue. Why would Uganda now negate itself from the whole process and choose Tanzania? Mm-hmm. That means something is not wrong in this country. Right. I'm not saying that all is bad. What I'm saying is the attitudes Kenyans have towards East Africans, and I will give Uhuru 70% on this time when he came up with this policy of integration without communication, integration without validation, integration without sitting down and putting down the infrastructure of just wanting Kenyans, anyone from East Africa to come in and go out, given the fact that we have security issues. Mm-hmm. Lack of coherent policy has led to suspicion of member states looking at Kenya as a pariah state in terms of insecurity in the northeastern province where the lapse was supposed to pass, and also corruption. Right.
Kipchumba, how do we redeem that image within the East African community? Because it is largely impacting on the economy, not just of Kenya, but of the region as well.
I think, from how I look at it, is that Kenya is playing a policy whereby we are open, but we have neighbors who have other ideas. The president has tried as much as he could. He has the zeal for integration. Even in his speech, if you could listen to his swearing-in speech, you could pick a lot from the speech that talks towards integration of even the entire Africa. But when it comes to our neighbors reciprocating back, we get there's a lot of lukewarmness around that area. In the sense that if you see a president auctioning cows from a neighboring state and we are in East Africa, that talks a lot about how we have entrenched the vision we have as a community. Because how can we say we are in a community and the first thing you do when our cows digress to your place, you auction them. You see one day chick being burnt. What does that communicate to us as a people. Do you expect Kenyans to do the same, to go to Tanzania with the same vigor? I don't think so. When Kenyans do business in South Sudan, we have a lot of issues and we have a lot of stories that have come back. Kenyans have been killed and what have you. So I think as a nation, we need to sit back and ask ourselves, have that meeting of our own as a country. Do we really need this East Africa community? Because we are getting a raw deal at some point. Because Kenyans in this region are the most enterprising, are the people who are fearless when it comes to business. We might have our shortcomings in terms of corruption and all other things, but in terms of our ability and agility to do business, we are the best in the region. But that one has not been rewarded. Right. Yes, we might have missed out in the whatever to do business with Uganda in terms of transporting their oil, but we need to ask ourselves, how do the other nations view us as a country?
And also the other question would be, why do they view us the way they view us, Mr. Manyora?
I think others are just from their perception. They are neither here nor there.
So Kenya hasn't done anything to warrant some of these
Yes, because when you say Kenyans have a funny way of doing business. What do you really mean when we are best ranked in East Africa in terms of ease of doing business? If you go to Rwanda, you realize Kenyans have a better way of doing business than even them when it comes to world ranking. But the problem is, do we really know what our value is in this region? Right. That is the question.
All right, Mr. Manyora, are our neighbors just being mean and bullying us as Kenya? Or
you know, it has a little history to it. First, we started very well in the 1960s, when East Africa was quite something to be proud of, and we shared services, railways and harbors, Kenya Airways, and so on and so forth. And we used the same currency, the East African shilling, for a while. We had the same university, just one, and the others were colleges. So we started off very well, and Kenyans and Ugandans and Tanzanians were really just one and the same people, as they had been before colonialism. But because we pursued different paths in terms of ideology, with Kenya being viewed by the neighbors as being too capitalist. Remember, before Obote was overturned, he was turning east with his common man's charter. Part of why even the British and the Americans celebrated his overthrow, unknown to many of these young people. So it was Kenya that was capitalist. Tanzania was decidedly, and in practice, definitely socialist. So because of those differences, they were irreconcilable, and by 1977, the thing had to break. So it broke. And from that time onwards, we were always viewed with suspicion, sometimes hatred. We were seen to be too capitalistic, too money-minded, compared to our brothers, say, in Tanzania, who are with the Sisi na Ujamaa, Sisi na Ubepari. So that has been the problem. Even today, if you happen to go to Zanzibar, for example, and some parts of Tanzania, if you say you are Kenyan and somebody says they are Ugandan and they are buying things, you look at the way Tanzanians look at you. That is a background. Now, when we are coming to this current integration, there are certain things Kenya wants to move fast. But these other people fear you are moving fast because you are ahead of us. So because of being ahead of Tanzania and Uganda, we are viewed sometimes with some suspicion, justifiable sometimes. Because if you say, for example, a very simple thing, let's have an open policy on movement of labor. Who will benefit? All Tanzanians' private schools, for example, they will want to employ Kenyan teachers. But we are much better. So they are justified in viewing us with some element of suspicion because of being ahead of them in many respects.
All right, all right.